but this is what you are reading in chapter 5. I'm not going to cover every single detail, so it is important you do the reading before you take the quiz, but this should help you understand the chapter if you're watching it before you read, or if you've already read, it's a good way to go back and try to get a sense of what was actually going on. First thing to consider is simply what we mean by culture. Culture is treated as this incredibly important concept. We use it in many different ways. It can refer to a lot of different things. And it's basically kind of this idea of you know it when you see it. We ignore culture when we're immersed in it. And that's why I have this picture of a fish. There's an old joke that, I forget the exact details of the joke, but it's basically a fish doesn't know it's in the water till it's outside of the water, right? If a fish says to another fish, hey, you're in the water, fish has no idea what you're talking about. It's similar to that with culture. We often don't think about our culture until we're encountering or leaving our culture behind. Then suddenly you realize that things are different. Then suddenly you miss those things that you took for granted, those things that you thought were normal. But what do we actually mean? A good place to start is that dictionary type of definition. So this is the type of definition you'll also see in the chapter that you're reading. Culture can be loosely defined as a set of beliefs, traditions, and practices. That means it includes the way we speak, the food we eat, the way we dress, the rituals we have, the meanings of symbols that we exchange. So it could go with language, or it could be something like fashion. And so it's important to note the key thing here is culture is not biological. Rather, it's this thing that's passed down from generation to generation. We pass it down through communication, but it also is the communication that we learn how to use. We learn culture from our families and from any institution in society. And we're going to talk about institutions in the next 2 weeks. Every picture I have here is an example of culture, right? Engaging in cockfighting, a boardroom meeting, thinking about how people dress, the ties they wear, how we interpret pets, right? What symbol does that convey to you? What emotion does it invoke? Or something like hot dogs and baseball, right? Those are forms of culture. Now, the concept of culture, if we go way back to the original use, it has evolved and expanded throughout history. The oldest understanding of culture just focused on the distinction between natural environment, that park on the left, right, old growth trees, and what has been modified or created by humans. So culture simply means it is not nature. It is something that we have modified. However, as we think about culture, it's important to think again about the history, both the good and bad. As Europeans came into contact with non-Westerners during this time of colonization, during this time of imperialism, culture turned into this term meaning the difference between people, and that difference could be viewed positively or negatively. Basically, it was used to justify colonial expansion. Western Europeans would go to other countries and say, you do things different, right? You have different food, you have a different way of carrying baskets, you do all these things different, you listen to different music, therefore you are lesser than us, therefore we can take your land and not feel guilty. You are not fully human in the same way as us. Or if we consider you human, we consider you to be lesser. And culture would be an excuse, right? The idea that was colonization was bringing something good to people because you were sharing something. Now, you can see the danger here already. Culture can create solidarity between groups. We share a culture, we share something in common, but it also creates this idea of us versus them. Culture has the power to unite, but it also has the power to divide. Now, sociologists urge us to take caution not to be judgmental when evaluating other cultures. This was a big part of the Nasarima reading. Our job is not to determine which culture is best. Instead, it's to understand how and why cultures do the things they do, how they may be similar to each other, also how they may be different. This can be a discussion of where culture comes from and the outcomes of that culture. It could end up being a negative critique, but it's not about creating a hierarchy or simply freezing a culture and saying this is what those people do. The next thing we have to consider is in the 18th and 19th century, this new dimension emerged when people were talking about culture. It was this idea that when you said to have culture meant you were doing something that was seen as intellectually refined, right? To have culture was to go to the opera. To have culture was to know how to eat a fancy dinner. In a sense, to have culture meant doing the things that wealthy and educated people do, right? Again, this was trying to rank culture. Much like that last slide, culture was being ranked. Here it's about the elites ranking culture. Instead of ranking versus other people outside the borders, it was ranking within the borders. Here we can see the distinction between high and low culture. High culture is seen as refined taste or the things that elite do. And by elite, we can mean having money or education, right? These are not the things that poor people do. That is what is referred to as low culture. American cheese, monster truck driving, or mudding, right? Driving a truck around in the field. That's considered low culture. Now, in my opinion, I would rather drive the truck around in the field or eat American cheese instead of going to the opera. But you can see that distinction between high and low. As sociologists, we will understand how do these things get ranked, and what symbols get attached to them, what meaning gets attached. Another way to think about this is the difference between elite culture, which could be interchangeable with high culture, and popular culture. High culture is something you need to be educated into. You know how to speak, it's seen as refined. Popular culture is something the masses do. And there's a lot of examples of this. This is straight from the textbook, but I thought it was really useful. Looking at the distribution of income in the United States, so on the left-hand side we can see this, right? The majority of the population is working class or poor within the United States. These lower brackets, earning less than 20K, earning less than 50K, your family, earning less than 75K. That makes up the majority of people. But if you go to things associated with high culture, ballet, jazz and classical music, art museums, opera, all those type of things, we see a difference, right? Who are the people who are going to those events? Well, it's the people who have the majority of money. They actually make up half of the people going to those events. So we can see, and the lower class populations, those making less than 20K, the poorest of the categories in this chart, only 3% of the people who go to these kind of elite cultural events, even though it doesn't necessarily cost much money, but it shows how culture can divide and how taste is reproduced by the group that you're part of. All right, next key distinction: material versus non-material culture. Material culture is everything that is part of a constructed environment, such as books, fashions, and monuments. In a sense, items in a culture do not have meaning inherently. We assign meaning to them, right? In American culture, we know that a chair is for sitting in. But it could also be used as a stepladder. It could be used as a weapon. It could be used as decoration. But we've attached a certain meaning to it. When we see a Yankees hat, we know what that symbolizes, right? We know what that logo on it means. But we could even say the meaning is different when it's a flat brim hat versus a curved hat. It could be different based on the age of the hat. All those things matter. How you wear it, whether it's facing forward, whether it's facing backwards, whether it's facing sideways. All those mean different things, right? The cross that you're wearing on your neck, that would be material culture. The Lincoln Memorial, that is this giant material culture that links to the larger American population. Material culture does not equal materialistic. People make this mistake every semester. Materialistic means being overly obsessed or desiring to have material culture that has great value. Material culture is everything physical in our culture that has meaning. Materialistic means you want more of that stuff to show your worth. Non-material culture are these things you can't touch, right? It works in a similar way as material culture. As a society, we determine the values, beliefs, behaviors, and social norms that we find appropriate or acceptable, but they aren't things that you can just grab a hold of. The Bible is material culture, but religion and those ideas are non-material culture. Language is a non-material culture. Political belief is a really strong example of non-material culture. All right, let's keep going with some of these terms. And I know this is a lot. You can watch this video again, but also this is really designed just to help you work your way through the book, picking out some of those key things, making sure you understand them, especially if you prefer watching a video and listening instead of reading every little detail. Next thing you need to know: values, norms, and socialization. Values are these bigger things that we hold on into society that tell us something is better or worse. What is good? What is bad? What is considered beautiful? What is considered ugly? What's considered appropriate? What considered not appropriate? What's considered desirable? What's considered undesirable? Those are all values we hold on to. Norms are the behaviors that follow. Socialization is how we learn those values and those norms. We could think of an example. And it's key. We learn these things from an early age. Even before we begin to talk, all these different institutions teach us these things. Our family teaches us this. The education system teaches us this. The media teaches us this stuff. So what would be a value? Say you have the value that education is good. Taught from a young age that you're supposed to care about this thing, education. It's seen as a good. It's not seen as a bad. What norm follows? Well, you go to school, you go to college. As a society, we create a law that tells you when you're younger, you actually have to go to school. Those are the norms that follow the value, right? So I hope that makes sense. Cultural lag, probably not as important a term, but I think it is really useful. The idea is that culture takes time to catch up with innovation. That could be technological, it could be legal, it could be a policy change. So an example would be gay marriage was legalized in New York. Does that mean that everyone in New York suddenly accepts gay marriage to be something that should be supported? No, of course not. So the culture lags behind the policy. Another example would be in hospitals. They implemented what's called a surgery checklist, right? Before every operation, the doctor is supposed to go through with the help of the nurse to check off every single one of those boxes saying, did you do X, Y, and Z? Yet, over and over, doctors don't follow this. It's not part of their culture. You can change the policy. It doesn't mean that the culture immediately catches up. Next idea, and this is really useful, especially when you're thinking about things you could write your sociological autobiography, the final assignment of the year, you could easily write about a subculture. A subculture is a group that is united by sets of concepts, values, traits, and or behavior that distinguishes it from the larger culture or society. You could say the subculture is playing out all those other qualities in a slightly different way. Now, what's key is members of a subculture are marginalized from society, but they're not completely outside of society. A counterculture, which we'll get to in the next slide, would be an example of that. So think of examples of subcultures would be something like people who listen to punk music, people who are vegans. They would still go to the same work as you, right? They would go to the same school. If you're into either of these things, you still go grocery shopping in the same place. You interact normally with people, but you still have markers that differentiate you. Think about top left. We have an example of subculture. Furries, right? People who have a different set of values and norms. Top right, goth kids. You see it in every teenager college movie, right? There's always the goth kids. It's a subculture that perseveres. Bodybuilders, different values and norms. One of the values is bigger is better. Lifting more weight is better. What norms go along with it, right? You can start to fill it in. Bottom right, skateboarding. That's an example. That's a picture of Odd Future for people who are interested in rap. But right, that's a group that we have certain associations with when you're a member of a subculture. Subculture also allows us to think about culture as a place of creation, not in the form of the solitary individual, but a group of people messing around with cultural expectations, coming up with a new slang, coming up with new ways to dress, deciding to wear high socks or different types of colors, listening to different music. Fan culture could be a subculture as well. If you're a huge fan of Beyonce, there's a name for that group, right? If you're a huge fan of Taylor Swift, there's a name for those fans. Either of those could be seen as a subculture. There's ways that you could recognize other people in that group. You share something with that group, values and norms. You share beliefs. You're not separate from larger society, but you're kind of separate from larger society. Counterculture is a subculture whose values and norms are so different that they reject larger society. They're seen as an opposition. It could be something like hippies, the Green Party, white nationalists, right-wing militia, neo-Nazis. Those are people pushing against the larger values of society. Sometimes countercultures become so dominant that they shape larger society, for better or worse. This is a scary time where we can see the overlapping of certain negative countercultural ideas with ideas becoming more mainstream in our society. But a counterculture is someone who actually pushes against the ideas of the larger population. Other key difference I want you to know. Subcultures versus stereotypes. Oftentimes when I explain subculture, people say, oh, it's just a collection of stereotypes. Not exactly. A subculture is a group that is united by a set of concepts, values, and traits and behaviors that they have chosen, right? When you are a member of the subculture, you understand how you're supposed to dress. You understand what music you're supposed to listen to. It's you choosing the norms and understanding the norms of the group. It's an insider perspective. The stereotype is a group that we simply apply to every individual in that group without actually having a sense of what's going on. And we assume that every individual within that group is different. In reality, in a subculture, all the people in the group are different. but they share certain qualities. From the outside, the stereotype simply says, oh, they're all goth kids, they're all furries, they're all bodybuilders, they're all the same, right? That's the difference. Subculture, inside understanding about the group. Stereotype could be the outside perspective, which is often slightly wrong. Again, culture, and this is a key point, culture helps us generate and define an insider group, but by doing so, it also always creates us versus them. Social boundaries are the way we police those differences. The social boundaries could be it could be effectively limit what you have access to or your opportunities, right? If we say we are the insiders of this culture, those who are different cannot take advantage of these things, that in a sense is creating a symbolic boundary that enforces the us versus them and limits people's opportunities based on what group they are part of. Culture has the ability to bridge, right? To bring people together. Oh, I listen to the same music as you. I'm into 80s punk, or I'm into 90s hip hop, or I'm into 1950s country music, whatever you want to list, right? It can bring us together across that barrier. We like the same food. But it also creates fences. It creates divides that are hard to cross. These are terms that I'm bringing up in the in-class exercise, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. You do need to know the difference between cultural ethnocentrism and cultural relativity. It's in the book. You can also just look up a dictionary definition. Make sure you understand the difference between these two terms. The other thing that's important is this idea of culture jam. Now, what is meant as culture jam? And I think this will be the last slide that I actually talk about. I'm not going to focus on the production of culture. I think that's a little bit unnecessary at this point. But culture jam is this idea that cultures move around, right? There is this constant movement between groups. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's online, sometimes it's people moving to new locations. We could think about how globalization has brought people together who had never really encountered each other in this way. So culture moves around. When that happens, there's potential for new combinations. This can be good or bad, right? It can be good when they mix together and something new and exciting happens. It can be bad when it obscures a history or completely one culture just takes over and dominates another. If you ever travel, you can see tons of examples of cultures mixing. If you're into music, you can see cultures mixing together. So culture jam is this idea there's a constant mixing happening. There's always this intercultural communication. There's always an exchange of ideas. Now, this can be good or bad. We'll return to this later in the semester when we talk about cultural appropriation. We'll talk a little bit about McDonaldization. Those are two examples of the danger. But just culture mixing in general, that sounds like a great thing. When power is equal, when people are able to take ideas from each other, that sounds like a good thing. So I'm going to end on an optimistic note because later on in the semester, we'll talk a little bit about the negatives. So that's the video. I hope it helps you understand culture. I'm going to call it there.